Hey there, guys. Alright, today we are back with some more extra credits. This time starting a new series. There's a series on the Zulu Empire of Africa. Shaka Zulu becomes king. Extra history number 1. Before we dive in, make sure you go and check out the links in the description box below. I would love it if you joined the Discord and followed me over at Twitch. Now, hearing the name Shaka Zulu actually brings me back. The PS3. This is completely random, a total tangent. And it probably wasn't even that good of a game in reality. But what I remember from this game, it was the game based on Deadliest Warrior, that TV series that really wasn't that good. It was just bloody, but it was fun. It was a fun time. But they had a video game. They had two different video games. They had one video game where it was just the different warriors, right? So you had the Spartans and Vikings and stuff. And then you had another one which was just like legendary people. Like you had Hannibal and Shaka Zulu. And actually, from what I'm remembering, the graphics were not that bad. They were pretty good for PS3, especially for that kind of game. That kind of game had good graphics for what it was. But it was like a fighting game, you know, like somewhat, I guess, closest you could compare it to Smash Bros. Or no, not Smash Bros, but like, oh, what's the name of it's Mortal Kombat. There we go. That's what I was trying to think of. Very much kind of like Mortal Kombat without the superhuman powers, but it was fun. It was a fun, and I don't know why, just seeing Shaka Zulu's name just brings me back to that fucking video game. Oh man, I'm tired. Anyways, let's waste enough time. Let's just dive into Shaka Zulu's history.
Welcome to a new series of Extra History. Before we start, I've got two announcements. Thanks to all of you who supported us on Patreon, Extra History is now officially a weekly show. New episodes will come out every Saturday from here on. And to help us do that, we've got a new team member. Allow me to introduce Heather McNabb. She and David will be trading off every series. I'm excited. Let's get started. For the next few weeks, we'll be covering...
What I love, though, is how this series is their most popular series, yet it wasn't the thing they like started with, yet it became what they're pretty much known for.
Covering the Zulu Empire, its rise, its fall, and its famous fight against the British. We'll see a small tribe become an empire. We'll see European factions playing out the game of power on South African shores. And we'll see a late post-Napoleonic army, well-drilled and equipped with modern rifles, be beaten by an indigenous population wielding nothing more than spears and hide shields. But before we can do so, we need to talk about sources. There's a lot about this period that we just don't know.
Yep.
It's not like the Sengoku Jidai, where it's simply hard to find translations of the more obscure records. In this case, we're dealing with a culture that didn't keep written records, so all we have to go on are scant accounts from European traders, and oral histories collected decades after the fact. Much of what we're gonna tell you...
Okay, I'm gonna actually, this is something I can actually speak on, because when I was taking a course on African history, I had to deal with this very same issue when writing my papers. By the way, I aced those fucking papers. I think for my final paper, I think I literally missed 1 point. Still salty about that 1 point. I should have gotten off 100. But anyways, I don't think this was intentional. And of course, there are things to question when it comes to oral stories that are occurring generations after the event. However, if you are talking, Africa has a history of really well-trained oral historians, right? Like, they're known as, in West Africa, they're known as griots, I believe. And they had to know their shit. Like, I would say the traditional ones are they're probably reasonably trustworthy sources, I would say. Of course, they're probably, I would also say, will be just as biased as reports from Britain from that come from this time period, right? And then the issue of sources, as they said, scant sources from European merchants. This is a very specific thing, because when it came, like, it is, of course, it makes it easier to think, like, oh, the Europeans were the only ones, like, that kept records at this time, and they didn't really care for the African, like, recording African history, stuff like that. And then, of course, Africa's own traditions is that they would not keep written records. They kept their records through oral tradition. The amount of resources is even smaller than that assumption. Not even European merchants could really, not even European merchant documents were necessarily cared for by Europeans. It was European governors, like people in positions of power and authority, were the ones who had their documents really cared for, kept safe and stuff like that, and used for history. Not the merchants. The merchants, rarely. So, like, not only do we see this dynamic between the white man and the people that they are colonizing, but we also see the power imbalance within European cultural society from this as well, where it's like, no, they don't even care about the mercantile class, the ones that are bringing in the money. They don't care about the history coming from them. They're like, nah, only the people in the gubernatorial seats or whatever. This is, of course, very TLDR. I spent so many pages on one of my papers just talking about the lack of sources and exactly what kind of sources were kept safe and recorded and duplicated and whatnot, and what sources were not.
Especially about the early period we're covering, are best guesses by the historians and archaeologists who have worked tirelessly to piece together the puzzle of exactly what transformed the Zulus, a tribe perhaps as small as 1,500.
Also, I'm going to rant about a little bit on archaeologists. I don't know if this is their fault. I don't know whose fault this is. However, when I was doing research on this paper, or a previous paper of mine for that class, it was for the midterm paper, I believe. There was this, I had to talk about a little statue figurine found somewhere in West Africa. I can't remember exactly where it was found. But through my research of that, they couldn't narrow, so far it's been known for quite a while, this artifact. But the dating for it was, they had it covering a span of like 300 years, right? They couldn't narrow it down more than that. And then I decided, then I looked up some random Greek sculpture or something. And historians and archaeologists have been able to date that thing to within the decade before writing was a thing. So this wasn't something, this was several decades before, even maybe a century before, I can't remember, before written history became a thing. And they had that statue down to the decade. Down in a span of a decade. They were able to carbon date it. They haven't carbon dated this thing on African history. That annoyed me. That was like, yeah, this is some Eurocentrism shit right here. Like, come on, at least get it within a single century, not 3. Like, put some more effort in, damn.
100 people living in an area probably around 10 square miles, into an empire of 250,000 people, ruling over an area roughly the size of New Jersey.
I always forget how far south the Zulu are. I always picture them more north than that, but...
So, with that caveat, let's start laying out the background. Who were the Zulu people when this all began? What did life look like for them? How did they subsist? What was their government, their economy, their military? Well, they were a relatively minor tribe within the larger Bantu people, who occupied a region in what would now be the eastern part of South Africa. They had a largely pastoral economy, with wealth being measured in cattle, and the population mostly subsisting on maize and milk. They operated under a kingship, but they had very little in the way of what we would consider centralized governance. And war? Well, when our story begins, somewhere in the end of the 18th century, warfare in this region was more of a ritual affair than a destructive endeavor. Warriors would meet at a predetermined location and fling spears and insults at one another, but would rarely move in for close quarters fighting. This left the casualties very light, and it was almost unheard of for the winning side to follow up a victory by chasing down their opponents or sacking or conquering their land. Instead, battles would result in the transfer of a small amount of territory, or some cattle. But Shaka, who will be the central figure in the early part of our story, changed all this. He changed the weapons, the tactics, and perhaps most importantly, the philosophy of war in the region. He brought in close quarters combat, replacing the traditional long throwing spear with a shorter thrusting spear that was devastating when used in a melee. He developed a system of envelopment tactics known as the bullhorn formation, which I'll explain in more detail later. And he changed war from a means of settling minor disputes to an activity of slaughter and conquest. So who was Shaka? Shaka was the eldest son of the leader of the Zulu people, but he was considered illegitimate, and so wasn't named the heir to the Zulu kingdom. In fact, his name, Shaka, means intestinal beetle, which was sort of the cover story for his mother's untimely pregnancy. This becomes kind of hilarious when you realize that we in the West often call him Shaka Zulu, and since the word Zulu actually means heaven in the Zulu language, we're basically calling him intestinal beetle heaven. So, enjoy that. Anyway,
Nice.
at the age of 7, because of his illegitimacy, Shaka was sent to live with his mother among the Ilangeni, a neighboring tribe. From there, he moved on to the Matetwa, the most powerful tribe in the region, where he served as a warrior first for a man named Job, and then for Job's successor, a man named Dingiswayo. Dingiswayo took notice of Shaka's unusual prowess as a close combat fighter, and when he discovered that Shaka was actually of royal blood, put him in charge of an ibuto, which you can basically think of as a regiment. And it's here that Shaka really began to refine his tactics. The traditional ibuto were armed with long throwing spears, and while they practiced the use of their weapons, they didn't do much in terms of practicing unit tactics. Generally, they would show up to the battlefield as more of a loose mob than a cohesive fighting unit. But Shaka began to experiment with this. He armed his men with the short stabbing spear, and drilled them in a tactic that he called the bullhorn. He'd split his men into 3 groups: the chest, the horns, and the loins. The chest would charge the enemy and pin them in hand-to-hand combat. Then the 2 branches of the horns, positioned to either side of the chest, would flank and envelop the pinned enemy. This whole time, the loins would sit behind the lines, acting as a rested reserve to be applied where needed. Interestingly, it's been said that Shaka would have these men sit with their backs to the fighting, so they wouldn't become panicked or charge overeagerly before he needed them. The brilliance of this system was that it was simple. Without much battlefield coordination, every man knew what he was supposed to do. If you're in the chest, you charge. If you're in the horns, you get around their flank. The system's simplicity meant that it could be applied in chaotic conditions, without much of the signaling that was required by modern armies. With these deadly new weapons and tactics, Shaka became a force to be reckoned with, and when his father died, he decided it was time to take his own. Shaka's half-brother, the legitimate heir, took the Zulu throne, but with the help of Dingiswayo, Shaka quickly had him assassinated, and simply moved in to take over the place. Dingiswayo was still the chief of the Zulus, so Shaka continued to serve him, but only a year later, Dingiswayo was killed by a man named Zwide, the ruler of the Ndwandwe, one of the most powerful tribes in the region. Shaka vowed vengeance for his leader's death, and stepped in to fill the void Dingiswayo had left behind, bringing the Matetwa, and with them many of the other local tribes, under his control. Shaka's vengeance, and the war he was about to bring, would lead to a period of unparalleled chaos and devastation.
That's a lot of years.
In Zulu, they call it the Mefakane. In English, we simply call it the Crushing. But before we delve into the Crushing, we should talk about why war here became genocide, and why the region was so primed to explode at the first signs of strife. A lot of it has to do with European influence. Not because Europeans tried to cause it, in fact there were many Europeans who tried to help, but given how radically different, how wealthy, how technologically separated the Europeans were from the local population, their mere presence dramatically destabilized the region.
Yes.
As European trade
I like how they're mentioning this, how they're providing, like, you know, this is, I don't know the history here, but of course what they're making it sound like here is that, at least for this situation that we're dealing with right now, at this moment in time, the Europeans aren't purposely fucking up. Aren't purposefully doing shady shit. But because of the cultural and technological differences and historical precedent between the two peoples, right? The mere presence is destabilizing. That's such a Such a good note that they didn't need to add, but they did.
New crops were introduced, which led to a population increase, which in turn led to greater competition for land. Meanwhile, European ships would trade for cattle to resupply their food stores, which made cattle even more valuable and led to an increase in raiding. At the same time, European traders also came looking for ivory, and to get ivory, you have to take down elephants, which requires a large degree of coordination from a group of people, which some have said led to the more coordinated and far more deadly tactics that Shaka was able to implement. To add to all of this, a drought caused the more water-hungry European crops to fail, which led to a famine. So the area, Natal, was already primed for disaster. Join us next week as we explore Shaka's quest for vengeance, see his descent into madness, and witness the horrors of the crushing.
Descent into madness, that... Okay. Well, that was the Africa Zulu Empire. Shaka Zulu becomes king, extra history #1 by Extra Credits. I hope you guys enjoyed. This was an okay part 1. Hopefully it gets better. But yeah, pretty fun. Hope you guys enjoyed. Remember to hit that like button and subscribe for more, and I will see you guys in the next video. Peace.